Nobody remembered the first shot the right way. What stayed with them was the sentence that came before it. Let go of her arm. For a moment, the whole ranch seemed to stop breathing. The well rope hung still over the stone lip. The mule in the shade quit chewing. Even the dust looked pinned in the noon heat, hanging between the porch and the corral like it was waiting for permission to fall. Mara Ellison stood beside the well her father had dug by hand. One man had her wrist twisted behind her hip. Another watched from horseback, with a smile that had nothing warm in it. And at the gate, sitting loose on a gray-blue roan with a bedroll tied behind the saddle, was a stranger nobody had seen ride in. He had not pulled a gun. He had not raised his voice. That was the part people talked about later, the quiet. The way one calm line reached across a yard full of armed men and made every hand tighten. Cade Barlow turned first, still holding Mara's wrist. "You lose the trail, mister?" The stranger did not look at him. His eyes went past Barlow, straight to the man in the saddle near the barn. Tobias Crane. Crane wore a black coat too clean for that country, and a silver watch chain bright enough to catch the sun. He had been smiling since he arrived. Men like that always smiled when they thought the law, the sheriff, and the price of water had all been settled in advance. "This is a private matter," Crane said. The stranger slid one hand down the reins as the roan lowered its head toward the trough. Leather creaked. The sound carried. Not while she's saying no. Mara felt Barlow's fingers dig harder into her skin. Not enough to break bone. Enough to remind her what kind of man he wanted to be. The stranger's gaze dropped to that hand. That was the warning. Crane's smile thinned. Behind him, Sheriff Moss Vane sat on his bay horse and stared at the dust near his stirrup, as if the county paid him not to see things that happened in daylight. Two ranch hands with Crane's mark burned into their saddles shifted wide, trying to make the stranger turn his head. He did not. Crane leaned forward. "You're sitting in the wrong yard." The stranger nodded once. "My horse can leave," he said. "Can yours say the same?" No one understood the line until Crane moved. His hand dropped for his revolver. The shot cracked the heat open. Crane folded over his saddle with a strangled breath. His revolver never cleared leather. It dropped into the dust beside the barn, spinning once before it stopped. Barlow let Mara go so fast his fingernails scraped her wrist. The stranger's gun smoked in his hand. He had shot Crane through the palm. Not the chest, not the throat. The palm. On purpose. "Anyone else want to buy land today?" he asked. No one answered. Mara stepped backward until her shoulder touched the well post. Her free hand found the short shotgun hidden behind the water barrel. Her father had kept it there after the first fence was cut. The wood felt rough and steady under her fingers. Crane clutched his bleeding hand against his coat, his face gray with pain and rage. The stranger lowered the revolver, but he did not holster it yet. "You're alive," he said. "Don't waste the gift." Sheriff Vane finally looked up. Not at Mara, not at Crane. At the stranger. "What name should I put on the complaint?" The stranger's face did not change. "Eli Rusk." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, like the name reached him from somewhere old and unwelcome. Mara noticed that. So did Crane. One of Crane's men eased his horse toward the gate. Eli turned the revolver just enough. The rider stopped. "All of you," Eli said. "Ride." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Barlow climbed onto his horse with one hand. The others followed. Crane let a man take his reins and turn him toward the south track. Mara kept the shotgun raised until the last rider disappeared behind the low white ridge. Only then did the yard begin to make sound again. A fly buzzed near the trough. The mule breathed. The well rope bumped once against the stone. Eli holstered his gun and stepped down from the saddle. He led the roan to water like nothing important had happened. Mara watched him drink before she spoke. "You knew who he was." "I knew what he was." "That isn't what I asked." Eli looked at the southern ridge. Then he took off his hat and wiped the dust line from his brow. "Tobias Crane works for Gideon Stroud," he said. "Stroud wants every well from here to Apache Wash." Mara's mouth tightened. "My father paid for this land." "I believe you." "County office says the record burned." "Convenient fire, it was." Eli turned then, and for the first time he really looked at her. Not with pity, not with surprise, more like he was measuring whether she already knew the shape of the trouble. She did. Her father had died in March. By April, fence posts started vanishing. In May, a steer was found cut open near the South Wash. In June, the sheriff began telling folks that orphaned land and widowed land had a way of changing hands if the paperwork wasn't nailed down. Mara had buried her father behind the cottonwoods and kept working. That was all she knew how to do. Eli nodded toward the well. "They'll come back." Mara looked at the red marks around her wrist. "So will I." Something almost like a smile touched his face. It was gone before it became one. "Then don't stand where they expect you." By sundown, Eli had walked the whole place. He said little. He looked at everything. The broken fence near the east pasture, the wheel ruts by the dry Arroyo, the old smokehouse with one loose plank, the root cellar cut half into the hill behind the kitchen, the narrow strip of hardpan where a horse had to slow before turning into the yard. Mara followed him with the shotgun tucked under one arm. "You're not much for talking," she said. "Talking already cost them a hand." "You're expecting them tonight?" "No." "Then why are you looking like that?" Eli crouched near the arroyo and lifted a rusted length of fencing wire from the grass. "Because men who get embarrassed in front of witnesses either come drunk," he pulled the wire straight, "or they come smarter." The second time, they came smarter. They did not shout from the ridge. They did not bunch up at the gate. Just before afternoon heat began to soften into evening, 6 riders appeared along 3 lines, spread wide enough that one gun could not cover them all. Mara saw the spacing and felt her stomach go cold. Eli was on the barn roof, flat against the shingles with his hat brim low. "Smokehouse," he called down. She was already moving. Inside the smokehouse, the air smelled of salt, ash, and old meat. She pushed the loose plank outward by 2 inches. Through the gap, she could see the yard, the well, the trough, and the shallow arroyo beyond it. Eli stepped into open view. That was his trick. He let men see exactly where he was. He let them think the rest of the place was empty. The lead rider was not Crane. Crane had been loud even when he tried not to be. This man was narrow, clean, and still. His coat was gray. His horse was black. His right hand rested nowhere near his gun, which made Mara trust him less. He stopped outside the yard. "Eli Rusk." Eli stood beside the trough. "You brought a better spokesman." The rider's eyes moved across the barn, the porch, the well. "My name is Silas Dre." "Good for you. Mr. Stroud says the woman leaves by sunset, and the well changes hands without more damage." Mara's grip tightened around the rifle. The woman. Not Mara, not Miss Ellison. The woman. Eli's voice stayed even. "And if she doesn't?" Dre tilted his head. "Then she learns that a signed county paper is heavier than a dead father's promise." Mara almost stepped out at that. Eli did not turn. He knew. Dre raised his left hand. Two riders began easing toward the Arroyo, trying to open an angle on the smokehouse and barn at the same time. The first horse crossed the hardpan. The animal jerked back hard, front legs cutting the air. The rider grabbed leather and nearly lost the saddle. Another horse spooked sideways. A third backed into dust, throwing the whole line crooked. Mara pushed the loose plank wider and set the rifle through the gap. The bullet struck the ground 6 inches in front of the second rider's horse. Dust jumped up into the animal's chest. "Next one breaks a leg," Mara called. Her voice surprised even her. It did not shake. Dre did not look at the smokehouse. That was how Mara knew he was dangerous. His eyes stayed on Eli. She learns fast. She had a good teacher. Her father? Eli's hand hung loose beside his holster. "No," he said. "Trouble." For the first time, something moved in Dre's face. Amusement, maybe. Or respect. Then his hand blurred. Eli fired once. Dre's gun hit the dirt before the man could bring the barrel level. Blood opened across his knuckles. The riders froze, not from surprise this time, from understanding. Eli had done it twice. 2 different men, 2 different days. Same message. "Ride out," Eli said. Nobody made him say it again. One rider took Dre's reins. Another cut the fencing wire with a knife and backed away from it like the wire itself was alive. Slowly, the 6 men withdrew over the ridge. Mara stayed in the smokehouse until the last horse vanished. When she stepped out, her hands were steady. Her breathing was not. Eli picked Dre's revolver out of the dust and emptied it. "You didn't kill him?" "No." "Because dead men carry no messages?" Eli glanced at her. "You're listening now." "Hard not to." He laid the empty gun on the trough rail. "They'll tell Stroud we made him bleed twice." "And then?" Eli looked west, where the sun had begun to flatten itself against the dry hills. "Then he'll stop sending men who can lose." That night, Mara did not sleep. Neither did Eli. They sat on opposite sides of the kitchen with the lamp turned low and a copy of her father's ledger between them. The book smelled like leather, dust, and pipe smoke. It had entries for calves born, fence wire bought, flour traded, and every payment her father had made toward the land. But the final deed was not there. Mara had looked 100 times. By midnight she looked again. By 2 in the morning, she closed the book and pressed both palms against the cover. My father said there was a federal patent, she whispered. He said county papers didn't matter if the government record was older. Where would he keep it? In the Bible, if it was family. In the cash box, if it was money. And if it was both? Mara looked up. Eli saw the answer arrive before she said it. At dawn, she went to the grave, not to dig, to read. Her father had carved one line under his name on the wooden marker. She had thought it was scripture. She had seen grief where there had been instruction. Under the date, in small, careful letters, it said, Psalm 37, Stone Shelf. Mara ran to the house. The family Bible sat inside the cupboard, heavy and worn. Psalm 37 held no paper, no hidden deed, no folded map. Her heart dropped. Then Eli tapped the kitchen wall beside the cupboard. Stone shelf. The old chimney base had 3 flat stones worked into it. The center stone sat a finger width proud. Mara worked the knife under it and pried. The stone came loose. Behind it was a tin packet wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was her father's federal patent, stamped, signed, older than the county claim. For the first time in months, Mara laughed. It came out once, cracked and wild, and then it turned into a breath she could not hold. Eli read the paper. His face hardened. This is why they came before you found it. Before Mara could answer, hoofbeats sounded from the road. Not 6 riders, not 3. 1 wagon, 2 deputies, and Sheriff Vane riding in front with a chain across his saddle. They did not come for blood that morning. They came for the gate. The sheriff unrolled a paper with a red county seal and read every word in a voice that made it clear the words had been paid for. By order of the county court, disputed title, temporary seizure, water access transferred, pending review. Mara stood on the porch with the patent folded inside her fist. Eli stood beside her. He could have shot the chain out of the sheriff's hand. They all knew it. That was why Vane smiled. You pull iron on a court seal, the sheriff said. And I don't need Stroud to take this ranch. You'll hand it to him. Mara raised the federal patent. This is older than your paper. Vane did not even read it. He nodded to a deputy. The man stepped forward, snatched the patent from Mara's hand, and tucked it under his coat. Mara lunged. Eli caught her by the arm, not hard, just enough. Don't, he said. The sheriff laughed. It was the smallest sound in the yard. It was also the ugliest. They chained the gate. They posted the seizure notice. They rode away with the only paper that could prove her father had been right. When the dust settled, Mara stood in the yard without moving. No gunfight could have hurt worse than that. Eli said nothing for a long time. Then he looked toward the north road. The preacher saw the packet. Mara blinked. What? When you opened it, did Reverend Pike see the stamp? She remembered the old man standing at the fence just after sunrise, hat in hand, too polite to come in while they were reading. Yes. Eli reached for his saddle. Then we still have a witness. To what? A stolen paper? To a federal record. Mara looked at the locked gate. And where are you going? Fort Stanton. That's 2 days. Not if the horse forgives me. He tightened the cinch. For the first time since he had ridden into her yard, Mara heard urgency in his voice. Not fear. Urgency. Eli swung into the saddle. If Stroud gets that patent buried, he'll own the story. If we get a marshal here first, he only owns stolen paper. Mara looked past him to the chained gate, the posted notice, the well behind it, and the house her father had built plank by plank. Go, she said. Eli held her eyes. Can you hold it? Mara lifted the shotgun. I already am. For 2 days, the ranch felt larger than it had ever felt before. The gate was chained, but Mara climbed through the fence and carried water anyway. She fed the mule. She checked the cattle. She moved the wire from the Arroyo and reset it closer to the barn. At night, she slept in the root cellar with the rifle across her lap. On the second evening, Stroud came himself. Not with a crowd, with 1 carriage, 2 men, and Sheriff Vane. Gideon Stroud was older than Mara expected. His beard was white. His boots were polished. He looked less like an outlaw than a banker, which made him worse. He stood outside the chained gate and looked at the ranch like it had already become a number in his book. You can't win this alone, he said. Mara stood on the other side of the fence. I don't see you inside. Stroud smiled. By Monday, you will. Then he looked at the well. That was when Mara understood. It was never the house, never the pasture, never the few tired cattle. It was water. In a dry country, 1 good well made every acre around it valuable. Her father had not left her much, but he had left her the thing men like Stroud could not build quickly and could not steal honestly. Stroud tapped the gate chain with his cane. Women mistake stubbornness for ownership. Mara raised the rifle just enough for the barrel to catch the last light. And men mistake paper for courage. The smile left his face. He did not answer. He did not have to. Everyone there heard hoofbeats. 4 riders came over the north rise. Eli rode in front on the gray-blue roan. Beside him rode a man in a dark coat with a U.S. Marshal's badge pinned plain against the dust. 2 deputies followed. Sheriff Vane stepped back before he seemed to know he had done it. The marshal dismounted at the gate. His name was Abram Cole, and he looked like a man who did not enjoy wasting words. He took 1 paper from inside his coat, then another. Federal patent record, he said. Certified copy from Fort Stanton. Stroud's face did not move. The marshal turned to the sheriff. You're carrying the original. Vane swallowed. I don't know what you're talking about. Eli looked at his coat pocket. The sheriff's hand twitched toward it. Marshal Cole saw the twitch. That was enough. Within 10 seconds, the sheriff was against the fence, with his hands bound behind him. The stolen patent slid from inside his coat and fell at Mara's feet. No one spoke. Mara picked it up. The paper had been folded badly. 1 corner was bent. There was sweat on it from the sheriff's pocket. But the stamp was still there. Her father's name was still there. The well was still hers. Stroud did not run. Men like him rarely run when they still believe money can arrive faster than consequence. He was wrong. By sunset, Gideon Stroud sat in the back of his own carriage with iron on his wrists. Sheriff Vane rode behind him on a deputy's horse. The chain came off Mara's gate and dropped into the dirt. Mara stood beside the well and watched the marshals take them south. Eli stood a few steps away. You'll have more quiet now, he said. Quiet isn't the same as peace. No. But I'll take it. He nodded. Marshal Cole called from the road. Eli turned toward his horse. Mara knew before he spoke. You're leaving. There are 3 men left who signed Stroud's papers. Cole wants them before they vanish. You going because he asked? Eli tightened the saddle strap. No. He looked at the well. Because men like that count on everyone getting tired. Mara understood that better than she wanted to. At sunrise, Eli rode south with the marshal. Mara did not ask him to stay. Not because she did not want to. Because some men are only free when they are moving toward unfinished work. And some women do not need saving once they remember what they are standing on. Weeks passed. The seizure notice came down. The fence posts went back up. A new lock went on the gate, though Mara laughed the first time she closed it because locks had never been what protected that place. Word came through in pieces. Stroud's bookkeeper talked. The county clerk resigned before he could be dragged out. Silas Dre lost 2 fingers and left the territory. Tobias Crane lived, but never again held a gun straight. As for Sheriff Vane, he learned that a badge could be removed by the same law it had once hidden behind. Mara heard all of it while mending harness, hauling water, and counting calves under a sky too wide to care about any man's plans. Then, one morning, just after the first light touched the well stones, a horse stopped at the gate. Gray-blue roan, dusty bedroll, dark hat. Eli Rusk waited there without calling out. Mara stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee in one hand and the shotgun resting easy in the quick of her arm. Gate's fixed, she said. I noticed. You planning to ask permission this time? Eli looked at the new lock, then at her. I was hoping the horse could. Mara looked down, and for the first time, she smiled before she meant to. She crossed the yard, opened the gate, and let the roan step through. The well rope moved lightly in the morning wind. No riders waited on the ridge. No county paper flapped on the post. No chain lay across the gate. Only the ranch, the water, and 2 people who knew exactly what fear sounded like when it rode in loud. Some men came believing a well could be taken by paper, blood, or a badge. Mara Ellison learned the truth. The well did not yield. The fear did.